Welcome to the Bible Forum. I'm Warren Sprouse. You are on the Bible Forum. It is May 13, 2018. It's a Sunday night, and we are talking about life, looking at it through a biblical lens. So folks have already gathered in the chat room. You might want to drift over there and interact with these folks. We're going to be spending the next 2 hours looking at life from a biblical perspective. We're going to look at the news. We're going to look at the social scheme, and we're going to look at the Word of God. We're going to look at all of this stuff through that biblical lens, and we're going to try to solve all the world's problems in 2 hours or less. We really enjoy having you here with us live. There are several ways to watch. You can watch on the internet. Go to the website, thebibleforum.net, and it's running there. You can see it. You can go to the Facebook page, and it will be running there. I will upload this to our YouTube page, and throughout the week, the segments will run from the web page. So we have a lot of different ways that you can tap into this. You can do it 24 hours a day. People around the world are tapping in, so it doesn't really matter. The whole thing obviously does come with a price, and we could use your help. We'd love that you would sign up to be a regular contributor, but a one-time gift is sufficient. We're glad to have any part of it. You can go to our PayPal account. There's a link on the website, and fill out the forms or whatever you have to do over there. You can send a personal check, make it out to Alternatives. The Bible Forum is a ministry of alternatives, biblical education, counseling and education. It's a 501c3 nonprofit corporation. We will send you a receipt. If you would like to send the check, just shoot me an email, thebibleforum@gmail.com, and I'll give you the address that you can use. There's a lot of stuff that's been going on in our world while we were apart. We've been apart for 168 hours. A young lady by the name of Juliet Schor, S-C-H-O-R, is a professor of sociology at Boston College, and she has been researching the leisure life of Americans. She's written a book. In the book that was published as a result, she talks about the overworked American, the unexpected decline in leisure. And it appears that the average American worker, now this is in 1987, worked more hours in the course of a year than did male peasants in the 13th century in Great Britain. The difference is that in 1620, male peasants were working on an average of 1,620 hours a year. In 1987, U.S. workers racked up 1,949 hours. Now, inquiring minds want to know, what about now? Where are we today? Well, apparently the average employee is now working slightly less than 1,811 hours. So the hours have dropped off. They are still significantly higher than those folks who were operating in the 13th century. This is based on information from the Pew analysis of the 2015 Labor Department data. And apparently that is the most recent data that we have available. Now keep in mind, there wasn't that much work available in 1620, comparatively. And 17th century Brits probably didn't want as much as 21st century Americans want. Largely because the commodity, wasn't available. No expensive cars, no houses to buy, no internet, computers, TVs, Bahama vacations. There just wasn't a lot of that stuff around. Did you pay your taxes yet? It's the middle of May. and that was supposed to have been done on April 17th. But I know that some folks pay late. You get a deferment, and you're able to do that. That's fine. The federal government took a record haul last month in taxes. 2018 saw more tax money coming in than ever. And we're not talking about the taxes that individuals paid on April 17th. The Congressional Budget Office said this was the biggest ever monthly budget surplus. They credited the surging economy that left Americans with more money in their paychecks and consequently had more money to pay to Uncle Sam in various ways. All told, the government collected $515 billion with a B dollars, spending just under $300 billion for a total monthly surplus of $218 billion. Now that swamped the previous monthly record of $190 billion that was set in 2001. CBO analysts were surprised by the surplus, which was some $40 billion more than they had guessed just a month ago. Analysts said they have a better idea of what's behind the surge, or they will have a better idea as more information comes in. But for now, they said it looks like individual taxpayers are paying more because they have higher incomes. They're buying more stuff. Except for the fact that this is a month-to-month comparison, I don't know if they separate what taxpayers send in on April 17th from what was collected on all these other sources. The article didn't seem to indicate one way or the other. In an ocean zone that no one knew existed, it appears it is home to more than 100 new species. That according to Oxford University. They're calling it the Rarefotic Zone, a rare light zone extending from 226 feet to 984 feet in the ocean. It joins 5 other areas which have distinct biological communities living and growing within each strata. The new section was discovered during a research mission to Bermuda organized by the British Charity for Ocean Exploration, something called NECTON, and led by marine research scientists from Oxford University. In addition to the new zone, more than 100 new species were discovered, including something called tanaids. These are minute crustaceans. Also dozens of new algae species and something called black wire coral. Black wire coral that stand up as high as 2 meters and extended beyond 6 feet high, these things, and more. The survey team spent hundreds of hours underwater, either scuba diving or using submersibles and remote operated vehicles, which can reach depths of 6,500 feet. It seems that our God is still surprising people as they look around this huge place called Mother Earth. We read this week about a 15-year-old boy who actually died. He was dead for 15 minutes and then came back to life. Now, the Bible teaches us that it is appointed unto men and boys and women and girls, human beings, to die once. But after that, the judgment. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 27. This boy has successfully defied that biblical declaration. Or did he? We hear about a lot of these things. Some of them we hear later on were outright frauds. But others still, to their clearly next dying day, maintain that it was true. Trenton McKinley was pronounced clinically dead. Now, you have to understand, and maybe people who write the articles don't take the time, but clinically dead is not the same as being truly dead. He appeared to be dead. He gave evidence of being dead. But in this case, as with so many others who have then revived and given testimony to seeing God or the lights or whatever experience they've had, in this case, the boy was not dead. Here's what he says he experienced during this time. I was in an open field walking straight, he said. There's no other explanation but God. There's no other way. Even doctors said so. Did you hear what I just said? He died, but he has a memory of that event and what he experienced during that time. Experiences are inconsistent with death. Memories are inconsistent with death. The reality here is being in a coma, even experiencing the cessation of vital signs, is apparently not the same as death. Human ability to gauge these things is far different than God's. And if we've learned anything, we know we don't know it all. Medical science has a book full of things it doesn't understand. Many medically impossible things have happened for which there is no explanation. In Trenton's case, the Bible tells us he was not dead. This is the word from God Almighty on this matter. You want to buy a home? You're in the house market? You want to buy your house in California? Be prepared to spend $10,000 more. The state of California has become the first state in the nation to mandate solar panels for all new homes. In a unanimous 5-0 vote Wednesday, the California Energy Commission approved a policy that will require all homes and apartments built after 2020 to have solar panels. They estimate it would add an average $10,000 to construction costs, that on a single-family home. They're trying to reduce energy use by more than 50%. And of course, if that happens, over time, these new owners would benefit. But you see, that won't be the homeowner's decision, will it? It should be. The state is adding $40 a month to the mortgage and estimating an $80 a month reduction on energy and maintenance costs. Sounds good. Haven't factored in the interest, the compound interest, by the way, or the fact that these things rarely work out the way people think. You've heard the old saying, no good deed goes unpunished. Well, a pro-life journalist by the name of David Daleiden just spent 30 months leading an undercover investigation that captured video evidence of Planned Parenthood conspiring to illegally harvest and sell aborted baby body parts. You've seen this on television, in the internet. You've probably seen some of the videos. Well, to reward him, the state of California has levied 15 felony charges. And an appeal to the federal appellate court was denied. Now is that the 9th or the 8th or whatever this district is, but these people out there on the left coast, they tend to do stuff like this. And the lawyers involved in all of this, according to them, were, quote, baffled by this decision until they realized that one of the judges is a man who has had what they call a long-standing professional relationship with a Planned Parenthood partner and affiliate, something called Good Samaritan Family Resource Center. This judge's wife has appeared in Facebook posts, quote, endorsing inflammatory public statements about the disputed facts of the case while harshly denigrating Mr. Daleiden, or Daleiden, however you pronounce it. So the state of California is charging this man with 15 felony charges. What are they? Domestic abuse, filming employees and abortion lobbyists in action. Planned Parenthood kills babies and sells their body parts. And David is going to go to jail for exposing that trade. Only in California. That's the news this week. We're going to take a look at what's going on in the Middle East next. Stay tuned. Okay, we can now maybe, hopefully, crank up the Facebook stream. Says it's running. Last week we didn't have Facebook, and the week before that we didn't have Facebook. For some reason, it did not record. And I told you last week that I was going to do the research, try to find out what was going on, and I found out. Unbeknownst to me, and I am fairly certain, almost positive I did not do this, in the settings at the Facebook video, the settings had changed. And it was no longer saying that it was going to be Facebook that received this video, but rather some other something. And of course, I don't have that other something. And so I've changed that, and now I have one more thing to check before I can start talking to you on a Sunday night. Make sure nobody, gremlins, nobody touches my computers. It's just one of those things. We're going to take a look at what's going on over in the Middle East. You do know that Israel is in the midst of this 70th year celebration. And tomorrow, Monday, which is probably already happening over there in the Middle East, is the day when they announced the U.S. Embassy is going to be there. They're going to have a groundbreaking ceremony or whatever they do. The president's daughter and her husband are there, and many other folks are there, and it's a big deal. This is all happening in Tel Aviv, and what's happening on the other side of the fence is that the Palestinians, Hamas and some others, are promising 100,000 people to protest this. They are not saying it, but you and I both know that when we get up in the morning and we see the news, we're going to see a whole bunch of violent things that have happened while we were resting. Say, oh well. We have some folks in the, I wish I didn't have to change glasses. This is tedious. A whole bunch of people in the chat room. I don't know if that's 16 people in the chat room or what. The number 17 has popped up there. It is Mother's Day, by the way, and I thank you. We've gotten some Mother's Day wishes. I haven't, but others in the household here have. And I do appreciate your thinking of my sweetie. She is a mother at heart. She's a great woman that way. Is that you, Russ? Yes, I hear. Well, I only hear you when you're talking. Yeah, okay. That's usually the way it works. Max here. Good to see you guys. Let's keep moving. We're running a little behind, and I don't want to dawdle. Time for some Muzak. Hi, you're on the Bible Forum. I'm Warren Sprouse. We're here every Sunday night from 8 until 10 p.m. Eastern. We do this on our website, thebibleforum.net. We also do it on our Facebook page, and then everything, all the videos are uploaded in whole and in parts in both of those places, as well as our YouTube channel. You need to go check some of these things out. It would keep you busy. Hundreds and hundreds of these videos, and you won't ever sleep. You've been paying attention to the news, at least I hope you have, and the news out of the Middle East is a little bit scary. Lots of things are going on. According to Reuters and according to the Associated Press, the war in Syria, which is continuing, is a war being fought from Syria and by Syrians, but also by other people. We have seen Russia involved over there, and now we see Iran. Folks are getting in on the action. The Prime Minister of Israel had just come back from spending a couple of days in Russia talking to Premier Putin. Got a promise from him that he would not be actively attacking Israel from Syria. And then immediately after that, Iran attacked Syria, and Russia retaliated and obliterated whatever it was they were using. And Russia honored their word. They stayed out. And so that's a good thing. But 20 missiles were fired from bases in Syria, according to Reuters news agency. More than 50 Iranian military targets were then consequently destroyed within a 90-minute period the next morning. This left the Quds Force, the overseas elite Iranian unit, trying to consolidate its presence in Syria. It left them kind of off balance. They were, according to the article, reeling. In this raid, the Israel Defense Force displayed just a sample, according to them, of its advanced intelligence-fueled precision firepower, dealing a crushing blow to Iran's assets in Syria. Much of Iran's military infrastructure in Syria was destroyed in this wave of strikes. First time Iran has engaged Israel this way. They characterized it as the most severe attempt yet by Iran to attack Israel. 4 rockets were intercepted by Israel. The others fell short of their targets. And the missile launcher that fired the rockets, Israel destroyed that and some other stuff. They were responding with their own attack against any of the equipment that they knew were involved in this. That, according to Israel's official explanation. Russia was informed ahead of Israel's attack by the Prime Minister, who had just returned from those meetings. Israel warned it will not accept a permanent Iranian military presence in Syria. President Trump's announcement on Tuesday to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal has also caused tensions to rise. One outlet said that Israel does not intend to escalate the situation, but noted troops will remain on very high alert. Should there be another Iranian attack, they said, we will be prepared for it. Russian officials on Friday indicated they will not supply the Syrian government with the advanced S-300 surface-to-air missile systems that heretofore they had promised. Israel's Minister of National Infrastructure, Energy, and Water Resources recently said, quote, if Assad, that's the head guy in Syria, if Assad continues to let Iranians operate from Syrian soil, he should know that he is signing his own death warrant and that it will be his end. we will topple his regime. The Jewish News Service reported that a week ago, Monday night, the Knesset plenum passed the first reading of the proposed nationality law, which seeks to canonize Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people. 64 Knesset members voted in favor of the law, 50 parliamentarians opposed. And if this measure becomes law, it would enshrine the state's Jewish symbols and designate Jerusalem as its capital city. The law would also designate Hebrew as the country's official language, with Arabic maintaining a special status to be utilized for the provision of state services to Arabic speakers. It also sets the Hebrew lunar calendar as the country's official calendar and makes Independence Day and other Jewish holidays, events, and memorial days international law. Meaning what? Meaning we're moving ever closer to the biblical scenario. Last Sunday, as we were here talking about other things, it was election day in Lebanon. Lebanon, as you know, is the nation just north of Israel. It's on the coast. Syria is north as well. They're side-by-side neighbors. Lebanon is a little smaller, a lot smaller. The people who won have effectively moved the Lebanese government closer to Russia and Iran, as the Prime Minister's pro-Western Future movement lost 1/3 of its parliamentary seats. It's being characterized as a win for Hezbollah and for Iran. The headline read, "Victory against Israel." Iran is working through Syria to destabilize the region. It now has a hook in Lebanon. And the question becomes, can Israel be far behind? What has become known as the Golden Age for Jewish-Christian relations apparently is now upon us. The International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, or the Fellowship as it's called, is breaking ground on its brand new Jerusalem headquarters, a multi-million-dollar building that will provide a home in the Holy Land for visiting Christians. They're calling it the Global Fellowship House. It's intended to be inspirational to both the Christian visitors and beneficial for the people of Israel. That according to prophecynewswatch.com. On his Facebook page, a man is seen pledging his allegiance not to ISIS, but to something called the Incel Rebellion, I-N-C-E-L. Had no idea what that Incel stands for. So I looked it up. It stands for involuntarily celibate. Website by the name of vox.com explained it by saying the rebellion is not an organized militant group, but rather an ideal developed by an online community of men united by their inability to convince women to have intimate relations with them. There have been at least 32 deaths that can be linked, at least in some way, to young men's frustration over their inability to convince women to have intimate relations with them. New York Times columnist Ross Douthat did just that. He wrote, quote, "The culture's dominant message about sex is still essentially Hefnerian." Hugh Hefner? Yeah. A message that frequency and variety is as close to what they call perfection as the human condition has to offer. In this worldview, he says, virginity and celibacy are at best strange, and at worst, pitiable states. The group's thinking includes the reality that the beautiful, the rich, the socially adept would enjoy the lion's share of the promised frequency and variety, while others would be relegated to new forms of loneliness and frustration. This reality put the lethal violence in Toronto and Santa Barbara, California, led George Mason University economist Robin Hanson to muse that, quote, one might plausibly argue that those with much less access to sex suffer to a similar degree as those with low income, and might similarly hope to gain from organizing around this identity, to lobby, and I'm not making this up, to lobby for redistribution of the benefits of the sexual revolution. That, my friends, is insanity. What on earth would redistribution entail? It's no more insane than telling young men that sex is everything, exposing them to countless hours of pornography, and then being shocked when young men feel cheated. But that's the kind of lunacy and insanity that is driving our culture. As we say, ideas have consequences, and bad ideas have victims. The victims of the sexual revolution are really adding up. This was originally an article published by Breakpoint.org. When we come back, I want to talk to you about Beth Moore and misogyny among Christian men. Stay tuned. Do you know what misogyny is? I had to look it up. I don't have the definition at the tip of my tongue. But it has to do with men who put women down or something to that effect. And Beth is upset. Do you know Beth Moore? Beth Moore is a woman preacher. She's a Bible study leader of women. But over the last 20 years, she has drifted occasionally over into speaking to men or being in co-ed environments. And she's giving them her advice. She's giving biblical advice. She gives it with the idea that this is the way you ought to be thinking, or this is the way you ought to be doing it. And for those of you who have known me for 20 years, you know that biblically speaking, that's the working definition of preaching. Preaching is this. It's why my face is on the website going like this. Preaching says, here's what God has to say, and you need to do it. You need to think about it. You need to get involved. It is, you need this information, and you need to respond to it. To preach is to expect a response. Not just to lay information out, and what do. It's up to you. Some preachers are like that, but then, of course, they're not preaching. They're sharing. And there are times when Beth, sweet as she is, good as she is, drifts over into that world. And she's struggled because there are preachers who don't think she ought to be doing it. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Hi, I'm Warren Sprouse. You're on the Bible Forum. We do this every Sunday night from 8 until 10 p.m. Eastern Time. We do it whether you like it or not. And not everybody is here in their seat at 8 o'clock on a Sunday night Eastern Time, but they do check it out later on. Each segment is separate and is posted on our website, thebibleforum.net. It plays in the video screen on the front page. All you have to do is click the button. They'll just keep coming. It's on our Facebook page. It's on our YouTube page and everything we've done. And so you can come back during the week. You don't have to be here on Sunday night. It's all right. I can see a day when I would do this on a Tuesday morning just because I can. And just play it back on Sunday night. I don't know. Sometimes you got things to do. I want to talk to you a little bit about misogyny among Christian men, Christian leaders. Here's a testimony from a co-ed after hearing noted Bible teacher Beth Moore speak. She says, quote, "In case you have never experienced Beth Moore's teaching outside the realm of women's events and teaching videos, it is an awesome thing to behold. I don't know if the co-ed environment brings out a different side of her, but she was especially on her game. She was fiery. She was powerful. She gripped each one of us with her prophetic message, and she straight up preached it. And herein lies the rub. Should women be preaching to men?" Beth Moore has written, I suppose it's maybe a verbal thing she's done that's been translated into words, or maybe it was written, I don't know. But she speaks out against this misogyny in the church. Misogyny is the prejudice against women. And Beth mentions things like saying, quote, "skewed attitudes many of our sisters encounter," end of quote, and how many churches are, quote, "quick to teach submission, but slow to point out that women are also among the followers of Christ," end of quote. One reference that she uses is that of Mary Magdalene, who was, in Beth's mind, the first evangelist. That's how she characterizes her, announcing to the disciples that Jesus was resurrected. There are a couple of more of these, but none of them illustrate women leading congregations of people spiritually or of being in spiritual leadership positions within the church. She also equates pastors and others who point out the women in the Bible for whom Paul and others had great respect, equating that somehow with God-ordained leadership. She asks that there be no place in the church for misogyny and dismissiveness toward women, for the same respect Jesus gave women, and for forgiveness from the brothers and sisters of Christ, apparently with whom she has been in contact, for her silence on this issue, which made her complicit, in her mind, in perpetuating an atmosphere damaging to the relational dynamic. She wants to be what she calls a good sister to both genders. Now, the issue of women in the church has become a very tricky and a very prickly subject over the last 50 years. A number of social and technical developments have served to thrust women into the same spotlight as men in terms of spiritual leadership. Most of this has been a deliberate attempt to break down the organizational and spiritual walls of separation, at least in terms of the ministry of men and of women. Some of it has simply been the immense need and popularity of the teaching of women in the church. I gotta tell you, they do it better. when it comes to talking to women about women's issues, ain't no man in the world can match a woman. In reaching out to fill a gap, however, some women, some churches, some denominations, some parachurch organizations have deliberately made no distinction between men and women when it comes to leadership in the church, spiritual or organizational. In the beginning, it was clearly seen and openly condemned. But with the charismatics taking advantage of public media to bring their vision of church into your living room, those limitations were quickly dissolved. In the end, even the more conservative churches looked the other way when it came to women's ministries, meaning they did not make a public fuss about women teaching men. I was a member of a church, an independent, fundamental, Bible-believing Baptist church, and a noted female teacher came for a weekend retreat with the ladies. And as we were meeting in Sunday school, the pastor stood up and said, I would like everybody from the teenagers on up to stay here in the main room, and the rest of you can go to your class, because there's some things I really want you to hear. And he proceeded to explain this wonderful woman who came and what she had said to the women, and he wanted her to say it to the men. And he used the word preaching. And when she got up, she preached. What did she do? She said, here are these principles, and you men need to pay attention to them. And you need to follow these principles in your home and in your life. Did you see that? You need to do this. That's preaching. Proposing, expecting a response. Teaching is just laying it out there. I would have a problem with her standing up there and deliberately teaching a bunch of men on what they're supposed to be doing. She did not say anything I couldn't say or haven't said, or maybe some other guy could do it. A violation. But it seemed warranted based on the need. Now, as far as the charismatics are concerned, they do this because they just simply don't care what the Bible teaches. I know. Send those cards and letters. I got illustrations. You can't defend it. And as far as those who do care, a couple of dynamics are driving that bus. The need women have to know and apply God's word to their everyday life. A need that exceeds most men's understanding. And secondly, the obvious ability that women have to get to the heart of the matter without appearing to be judgmental or domineering. They can tell you things, and these women go, oh, yeah, I needed to hear that. Man, if a man said something like that, there'd be blood on the street. But today, we don't seem to make any distinction. So what's Beth's complaint? Beth's complaint is that there are men who do make the distinction and apparently make certain that she knows it. It appears that they're putting her in her place, as it were. They might be doing it in a somewhat subtle way. They may just simply be ignoring her, not inviting her to come to their churches, or ignoring her ministry and all the rest of it. But whatever it is, it hurts. Now, pastors have the responsibility and the right to protect their congregations from error. And a church member who is operating out from under the recognized biblical authority structures is a Christian who is in error, even if what they say is right, good, and true. And a woman who is teaching men is out from under biblical authority. A woman in spiritual leadership in the broader world of organization or administration relative to spiritual things, unless this is a completely female-oriented, female-dominated, female-run organization, that woman is out from under biblical authority. She ought not be doing it. And that biblical authority in the church peeks out or has its expression in the pastor, in the elders of that church, in the leadership. What Beth is experiencing, apparently, is the social, emotional, organizational reproof or rebuff from pastors and others who actually believe what the Bible teaches, but who have become so emotionally engaged in this offensive kind of thing as to ignore their responsibility to be gracious, to be kind, to be loving. They see their role as protecting their congregation, protecting people from error. They see their responsibility as standing against that error. They then begin to respond to the sister in the Lord as the enemy instead of a fellow believer. Now, the truth is, these things are important issues for the pastor. He has a stance in the congregation and before God in terms of organization, as organizational authority. He is the spokesperson on how to live the Christian life. That's what spiritual leadership is all about. And he must make it clear that as far as the Bible is concerned, women do not teach men spiritual things. But at the same time, he needs to recognize and understand that in practical application, they do. Women are talking to men all the time, and they'll tell them stuff. You need to do that. It happens. That women very often know more about the practical issues of life and of family and of basic kindness than most men ever will is real. And should they be put in a place to share that understanding, they'll do it. And they'll do it with Bible verses. They'll do it with Bible doctrines. You going to get upset every time it happens? Now, in terms of balance, that women do this under the authority of their fathers, their husbands, or their pastors. Meaning that these men know what these women are doing, what they're teaching, in what context it's being offered, and why. And they're okay with that, biblically. That these men understand that the women are not seeking to supplant nor subvert any man's authority, that the gifts God has distributed among the church operate freely and in decency and order. In my 40 years of pastoral ministry, the only problems I ever had in a church in this area that we're discussing was in my first church. A church where these principles had never been taught, had never been illustrated. A church where the unofficial leaders were the women. 6 years later, that was not a problem. Because I dominated the scene and didn't allow it? No. But because I taught the other side when it came up. We didn't have a special series of messages on women's roles. And I modeled the kind of response that you ought to give. And my wife modeled the respect that a woman should have in these areas. And I did it with patience and with tact, and focused on teaching the men their biblical responsibility in home and in the church, strengthening them. Now, the reality is we lost some families. We lost some people whose wives were definitely in control, and no matter how subtle or how careful, they could smell it and they didn't like it and they had to go. And I didn't want them to go, but they did. Now, it is doubtful that these kinds of things are being taught in the average church today. And where they are, the issues that plague Beth just don't exist. Largely because the women don't push to have that authority. They have it. Women, guys, you know, the women have the authority. But they don't make it their priority. They don't have it officially recognizable because of the title that they have. But if you're in a church and you're a pastor or you're just a guy in the pew, you know, if mama ain't happy, nobody's happy. They understand God is working through men, but he's working through those women too. Men when it comes to leadership and authority. And those pastors who have the patience will wait for these little boys to actually become men. If Beth Moore were a member of my church, I would be her most enthusiastic cheerleader. But I would caution her not to cross the line and begin teaching groups of men, and certainly not to begin preaching the Word of God to anybody. Teaching, modeling, that's one thing. Preaching, by definition, is requiring those listening to what you say to do it. What you're telling them is what God wants them to do, and you are expecting them to respond that way. That's an entirely different dynamic. That's not Sunday school. That's not vacation Bible school. That's not a retreat. And it's a dangerous place for women when there are men in the audience, or when there are men who should be doing it. It's part and parcel of the chaos that is the church today, because we have thrown the Bible out. Yeah, almost literally. We give it lip service. I'll be talking a little bit about that a little bit later on this evening in a shocking development. But trust me when I tell you, in most of our churches, there are no rules, no more. We're looking at this invisible war. I started this a couple of weeks ago, and I thought I would take a week and just kind of do the background material, and then we could just jump into it, and we go. But this is lesson 3, and we're still doing background. It is a large subject. And I don't know if you're keeping up with it or even if you care. But most Christians like prophecy. They like to look at what God talks about the future. So there are people who are interested. The videos are available on the Bible Forum website. They are available on the Facebook. They're available on the YouTube channel. You can go back and you can watch, listen to them, take your notes. But it is my goal, my purpose, my hope, my prayer, that I will take these notes and, when I have time, We'll put them into a book form. It won't be called The Invisible War, because that title has already been taken by someone who is far and above more capable, and that back in the 60s. A lot of people use that title. I can't do it. I can't bring myself to do that. We'll come up with something else. But I want to share with you about what the Bible talks about in terms of Gentile world leadership and the final form thereof. This is part 3. Hi, I'm Warren Sprouse. You're on the Bible Forum. It is right now a Sunday night. It is May 13, 2018. We've been looking at a subject in a sequential manner called The Invisible War, a title I took from an older book. But we're talking about end times events, scenarios, and that sort of thing. This is part 3. We're going to be looking at the book of Daniel. We're going to be looking at Gentile world leadership and the final form thereof. In the run-up to current events, I've been trying to give you a quick summary of how we got here. We meaning Israel and the world. From Adam through Abraham, through Moses, through David. The process whereby God established Israel as a nation of chosen people. No, they did not choose God. God chose them. As a nation through which Messiah would come. As a nation by which God would redeem mankind. And then looking toward the future at a nation which will be at the very center of the final battle for earth. In all of this, the significant events are worked out in secret. The details are known to God and to God alone. But a great deal of it is an open secret. Much of it has already been revealed. And a lot of the future stuff has already been written and discussed. It's available. But in the midst of all of that, the vast majority of the world still does not know. And they don't know because they don't care. We're talking about the children of Israel, the nation of Israel. And as we've worked our way up to this point, we're seeing how the family of Jacob has grown into a nation of people, about 2 million strong, that during the 400 years of Egyptian captivity, they were welded into a nation, kept in one place until they swelled to this size and to this ability. And then God let them loose. And they have settled in the land of promise, the land that was promised to their forefather Abram. They are a once powerful and dominant nation, but they have fallen into disrepair under a sequence of ungodly kings. After David, after Solomon, neither especially perfect, there are only 1 or 2 bright spots in terms of kings. The rest are largely dissolute and ungodly. Not completely rejecting God's covenant, but completely ignoring it. And a powerful king has come, marching down from Babylon, conquering all that is in his path. His name is Cyrus. It is the 6th century BC, about 605. And having conquered Jerusalem, he has taken the best and the brightest back to Babylon to work for him. One of these young men is a fellow named Daniel. Daniel makes a name for himself by refusing to break the kosher laws and to eat food groups which God forbade Israel to eat. That he prospers under his diet above all of the other slaves is noticed. Now, that's a significant event all by itself. A jailer would notice that he's healthier. Skin texture, strength, resilience, general health is much better than all the rest of them. That's an interesting dynamic. But then you realize that where the king is an absolute despot, he has absolute power over everybody's life. You have prisoners and they die in your care, you're probably going to die too. Daniel would rise up through the ranks of leadership to be held in great respect by all the rulers of Babylon. Cyrus eventually dies and another takes his place, and another. About 19 years after Daniel gets there, Babylon would be destroyed. I'll take that back. Babylon would come again to Jerusalem, and this time they would destroy the temple. A man by the name of Nebuzaradan is credited with that feat. It is possible that this is the Bible's Nebuchadnezzar. About 586 BC, 40 years after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, Daniel is in his 80s and part of what is called the wise men of the kingdom. And then God gives the king, Nebuchadnezzar, a vision of the future. A vision neither the king could remember, nor the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, or the Chaldeans could explain. You see, he doesn't remember himself what it was. And so he wants all of these special people to tell him first, what was my dream, and then what did it mean? And because they could not tell the king about his dream, he orders the whole bunch to be executed. Daniel chapter 2, beginning at verse 12, "For this cause the king was angry and very furious, and commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. And the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain. And they sought Daniel and his fellows to be slain. When the captain came to execute Daniel, Daniel asked to see the king. The king gave Daniel time, and Daniel told his trusted companions that they should pray the God of heaven concerning the ruler's secret. And God answered that prayer, giving Daniel the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had seen and now cannot remember. Daniel later records all of this in his writings, the book of Daniel, chapter 2. You see, Nebuchadnezzar had seen the image of a man standing. Daniel characterized the image as terrible, frightening. The image had a head of gold, breastplate and arms of silver, a belly and thighs of iron, feet that were partly of iron, partly of clay, and on those feet were 10 toes. And while he was watching this image, looking at it, beholding it, the image was destroyed. A stone characterized in the text as not cut out by man's hand came out of the sky, crashing down upon the feet of the image, breaking them into pieces. As a result, the image fell, and the brass and the silver and the gold all broke into pieces. Pieces small enough that the wind carried them away, never to be seen again. Now that would seem to be the hard part, telling the king what he saw in a dream that even he doesn't remember. But there is still the meaning of the dream. And Daniel reveals this to be an image of the times of the Gentiles. Now, keep in mind, God is working through Israel. Israel are not Gentile. The Gentile nations are all unbelievers. They are all outside the covenants of God. And so here are the great kingdoms to come. Kingdoms of the Gentiles that will be struck down, destroyed, but not gone. They will rise again, each one weaker than the one before. Daniel makes it clear that God is the one who raises them up and tears them down. The stone that struck the image was a stone not made by human hands. Now, historically, the head of gold is Babylon the Great, where Daniel is right now, talking to the king. The belly and the thighs represent the Medo-Persian Empire. They would defeat Babylon, but they were not stronger, inherently stronger than Babylon. The legs of iron, Greece, ultimately under Alexander. The feet and toes of iron and clay is a picture of Rome. Each empire, Gentile empire, is represented in terms of their strengths. The 10 toes correspond to the final form of Western civilization. The 10 kings of Revelation 17. 10 horns, it says, equal 10 kings who receive power with the beast. 10 kings who make war with the Lamb and are overcome. Now, it's not simply a coincidence that the core of the European Union is comprised of the territory conquered by Charlemagne in the late 700s and early 800s AD. Charlemagne, crowned king of the Holy Roman Empire by Pope Leo III on December 25th, 799 AD. He was crowned king of the 4 empires, after which the prophecy of Daniel indicates would come the end of the world. Now, given this political belief, the French Charlemagne would adopt Roman culture, Roman architecture, law, literature, and knowledge, keeping it alive. The result, the wisdom of antiquity, would come to Europe. Everything the modern world of today knows about antiquity, it knows because of the Carolingian Renaissance, which preserved it, keeping it from being destroyed. God making certain that not only would this knowledge be retained, but that the prophecy would come true. Out of the Carolingian Renaissance came modern Europe and eventually the European Union. A key ingredient in the biblical end-time scenario. The original European Union corresponds to this ancient Holy Roman Empire. Daniel 9 gives us more detail In the dream, Daniel reports to Nebuchadnezzar that this 90-foot tall statue was 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide, with its head of fine gold, its breast and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of brass, and the legs, 2 legs of iron, and the feet with the toes, part iron, part clay. Our own demeaning epithet, we speak of people who have feet of clay, reflects this hidden flaw, that someone would have a hidden weakness. Be strong as you want, but be exposed to great pressure, and the feet won't take the pressure. It will collapse and everything will come crashing down. Daniel reveals the stone which was cut out without hands to be God's judgment. Daniel chapter 2, verses 34 and 35. It strikes those weakened feet and the whole thing comes crashing down. Daniel writes, "Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, the gold broken to pieces, and together became as the chaff which the wind carried away." That's the overview. Next come the details. He explains that Nebuchadnezzar is the head of gold, ruling the known world. But after him will come another kingdom, inferior to his, as silver is inferior to gold. We now know this to be the Medo-Persian Empire. After that, a third kingdom would come, the belly, the thighs of brass. Brass being less precious than silver. And here is Alexander the Great of Macedonia. And after this will come legs of iron. And finally, mixed feet and toes of iron, mixed with clay. Rome. Along with this, the final form of world power, which will also be Roman. The iron and the clay represent elements that will not join with one another, not cleave together in strength. There are 10 toes on these feet, corresponding to the 10 kings who make their appearance in the end times. Their story is for later. The point here is that Babylon is the foremost illustration of Gentile government. After Babylon, everything is downhill in terms of character, in terms of power, in terms of wealth, until it comes to the end, when the stone strikes the feet and the whole thing comes crashing down. The crashing occurs when a stone not cut by human hands comes from the heavens to strike at the feet, the remaining form of Gentile government. And at that point, the whole image is destroyed. Meaning that Gentile rule is forever gone. Jesus is now here. In the future, we'll look more closely at what all of this means, but for now, you need to know that we are in the final form of Gentile world power. Western civilization is rooted in Roman law and custom. Western civilization has given a great deal to this world in terms of human governance, wealth, and power. But Western civilization will produce the 7-headed beast with 10 horns of Revelation chapter 12, and the scarlet-colored beast having 7 heads and 10 horns of Revelation chapter 17. They will consist of the final form of Gentile world power. 10 kings which receive power with the beast for 1 hour. 10 kings which shall hate the woman who rides the beast and make her desolate and naked before it's all over. That woman, she is Babylon. Babylon the Great, mother of harlots, and of the earth's abominations. She is drunk with the blood of the saints. Her 7 heads represent the 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. The 7 mountains are the 7 kings that rule the Gentile world during the Great Tribulation. The beast upon which she rides, well, he is the 8th king. He's part of the 7 original, and all of whom will go into perdition for making war against the Lamb. The whole scenario is starting to get very complicated. But in its complexity, it is becoming much more relevant. And we'll take a look at all of that more closely next time. Okay, we are now where are we? We are now on the cusp of our counseling corner. All right, we've got the chat room humming. We've got more people than we had before. That's a good thing. Okay, we've got pretty much regulars. There's a couple of folks missing. 3 or 4, actually. That's okay. I would respond, but for some reason, well, I guess I can. The little thing that you write in is below the black thing on my... I can't see what I'm writing. I don't know if I'm spelling it right. So I'm not making the effort here. All right. Now what? The counseling corner. I'm starting to get so I like this corner. Do you need a counselor? I remember when we didn't have them. Good evening, I'm Warren Sprouse. You are on the Bible Forum, and we are in our counseling corner. Do you need a counselor? Have you ever been to a counselor? A psychologist, a psychiatrist, a Christian counselor, your pastor? What was your experience? Well, largely, it's about telling this person as much personal information as possible about what's going on, about you, about the other person or persons, about other counsel you may have gotten. The theory is, in order to help you, the counselor must know you, must understand what you're going through, understand your history and or what you've tried in the past and so forth. This is why the jokes are made primarily about psychiatrists who have people lying on a couch or just sitting comfortably someplace and talking about whatever they want to talk about. And they do this for years in some cases, in 45-minute increments at $100, $200 a pop, before they even know how they can help you, because they have to get to know you and know what's been ticking in your life. Would it surprise you to know that none of this is necessary? Now, I'm speaking of the Christian and or the Christian counseling process. But it's really true about all the other types as well. Now keep in mind the psychological community is not as solid and orderly and structurally, strong as you might think. One website lists 24 different types of counseling. It's focused on what you're struggling with and offers specific counsel for that particular problem, as well as more generalized counseling like hypnotherapy, stress management, rehabilitation, stuff like that. But trust me when I tell you there are many, many more types of counseling and or therapies available. One for just about anything and anybody. But also keep in mind that not one of them deals with the core issue. You see, the core issue in your struggle is your soul. That immaterial part of your being that drives every other part. And none of these people are equipped to handle that. Most of them won't even admit it exists. For example, if you have a punitive personality, what type of counseling do you need? If you have an addictive personality or fearful personality or a depressive personality, where do you go? And the odds are that each one of these would require a different sort of counsel. Medical doctors, psychiatrists can prescribe medications for all sorts of things. They call them mental disorders. And we've talked about this before. What is your mental? So it's my mind. Point to it. And you go like this. It's your brain. That's not your mind. The mind is an immaterial part of your being. You have physical disorders. You need a medical doctor. He can go right to the heart of it and tell you, yeah, I can fix it, or nope, nothing we can do about it. Or maybe your problems are just with your feelings. You know how many people just feel nobody loves them? Whether it's true or not, that's how they feel. And you can't tell me how I feel. And you can't be critical of how I feel. You don't know. You see it? That's the way it works. And many of these folks, especially if they have a medical degree, are giving medications. Medications that alter the chemical structures, alter the chemical imbalances, work to alleviate certain moods or pressures of one sort of things you can't identify. But what psychological drugs can't do, what psychological drugs won't do, is change who you are or how you make decisions. Over on the other side are the talk therapists, the behavioral therapists, applying all sorts of counseling theories, Freudian, Jungian, Rogerian, the list goes on. There are behavioral therapies like cognitive whatever, and all these things focused on helping people maximize their human potential. And then there's self-exploration, there's free will, there's self-actualization, and don't forget the Christian therapies. The secular group calls their treatments therapies. They're applying therapy. Sounds like a medical community. What they're doing is making money by talking to you and helping you understand yourself, your behavior, your values, and why life isn't working very well for you. But the reality is that life doesn't work very well for most of us. Life is not something out there that you seek to help you feel better. Life is what you make it. It's not whether or not your chemistry and environment or social structure will let you. There are millions of people who have lived and are living now who have serious medical problems and maybe mental problems, struggling with all sorts of discouragements. It's like nothing works the way it's supposed to in their life, and they are perfectly normal, happy, healthy people. They accept that you fall down and you skin your knee. It happens. They accept that not everything works the way it's supposed to. They accept that things get old, diseased, break. They don't go to pieces when they are thrust in with somebody who is just angry all the time or calls them names. They just ignore it. The mental health community feeds on the idea that whatever is going on is either a chemical imbalance or it's somebody else's fault. Very rarely is it my fault. And as I've said, if it is, we have a drug for you. And that's simplistic. It's not even fair. But it's the way it seems to work. About 50, 60 years ago, the Christian community got involved in this thing called counseling. Prior to that, people played the hand they were dealt. Christians had other Christians, or they had their pastor if they needed to talk to someone. But then somewhere, I don't know, it was in the 60s, 70s, somewhere in there, seminaries and Bible college started offering courses in counseling. And they did that in large part due to the need in their congregations. Pastors were finding more and more people who needed help, and they weren't equipped. And to tell you the truth, they didn't have the time. They don't yet, still. When people got televisions and started hearing about psychologists and psychiatrists, they wondered, why wasn't their pastor able to do this? Pastors started realizing their people wanted more than what they could offer. And now the church is fully involved in something called the Christian counseling movement. And it hasn't been good. For example, if you have a bad marriage, your husband or your wife is abusive, your mate is spending more money than you can earn, they're not coming home after work, going to the bars or worse. You have a marriage where all you do is fight with one another. You have a marriage where there is little or no communication. Maybe you have a bad temper or the other one does. Maybe one of you have a depressive personality. You're fearful. Name something, almost anything. If it's not a medical problem, what is it? Well, in a word, it's sin. It's not a phobia. It's not a 75-cent psychological term. It's sin. You've grown up giving in to your passions, your anger, your selfishness. Those are all sins, by the way. You've married for the wrong reason, maybe against your parents' counsel. That's sinful, destructive. Or maybe you just married too quickly, without wise counsel. Maybe you're a person who's just filled with pride. Nobody can tell you what to do. You know everything and everybody's wrong but you. Or prejudice. Or fear. Or guilt. Or fill in the blank. What counselor is there who can fix you? What drug will make you well? Now, very often counselors become crutches, at least as long as you can afford the $60 to $100 an hour fee. That's a 45 or 50-minute hour. Those who refuse, you will stop seeing, since they really don't understand you. Then there's the whole issue of transference. That's a big word. This is the psychiatric term for when a woman counselee begins to transfer her loyalty and or feelings from her husband to her counselor, sometimes her pastor. The wise counselor knows it's going to happen, sees it as it's developing, and stops seeing this person. We have lived through a few decades recently where this does not happen. Even in churches, among Christians. And many of these people have paid an awful price. Now, behavioral counseling is a conversation. The counselor needs time to understand what's really going on, and knows that the information that he or she needs is not going to be offered up initially. All sorts of things are going to be suggested as the problem. And so it's going to take some time to ferret through all of this and figure out what is the real problem. And sometimes the person who's having the problem doesn't know why, not really. Sometimes because that information is hidden, being too personal or maybe too condemning. And we human beings are prone to protect ourselves. Sitting with a man and a woman while they tell their side of the story, most often neither understands nor agrees with the other's version. Yeah, the event happened. They agree on the event, just not the reason why or the result. So how do you fix that? And how do you fix a broken marriage? You are expected to do that because you're being paid, unless you're a pastor. And then you're supposed to do it for nothing. So how do you fix a broken marriage? You can't do it with drugs. You can't even do it with therapy. The only way to fix it is with a commitment on the part of both individuals to see this thing through. Don't jump ship until we get to the place where you can do it. You can fix it with a shared desire to fix it no matter what. Forget the outdoor. It's not there. We're going to stay here and we're going to make this work. You fix it with a willingness for each person involved in this thing to deny self for the benefit of the other person. And you do this with a commitment to God's word and to one another, especially if you're married. You said that, till death do us part. There is no drug on earth that will make you love that selfish, tyrannical, angry, violent man you thought you loved at one time. And there's no drug on earth that will make a self-oriented, arrogant, dominant, domineering woman into a godly, loving wife and mother. It's not going to happen. You're in a marriage where you fight all the time. You need counseling? I'll give you the only counsel you need. Stop it. You can't agree on anything? Find something. You have opposing values. Fix it. You no longer have feelings for the other. So what? That's my counsel. You can't say stuff like that. But that's the reality. One or both of you strangled those feelings. Stop doing that. Marriage is a love relationship. It's not a legal contract. It's not even a social contract. And love is giving, expecting nothing in return. You married that pig. Well, I didn't know he was like... You were responsible to know. The odds are, if you had parents that were responsible and loving and cared, they probably told you not to do it. If you asked them. Start loving. Meaning, start giving to the other without conditions. Love is giving, expecting nothing in return. Who does this today? Practically no one. And that's the reality because the culture doesn't require it. But what about the Christian? Is the Christian supposed to be a follower of the culture or a follower of Christ? The Christ who taught us to love without conditions. Love expecting nothing in return. Love giving. One of the cultural problems we have is that children are growing up watching parents fight or at least live separate lives. And they grow up wondering, what's the point? And a large percentage aren't marrying at all because they've seen marriage at home. 55 years of marriage to the same woman. And we still have moments of disagreement or misunderstanding or simply opposing views on certain subjects. So what? None of that is worth fighting over or creating a hostile environment. Guys, you still have to close your eyes at night. We are a society convinced there's a pill for everything. Not a literal pill, but there's an instant fix of some kind. If I just do this, say that, read that, pray that prayer, I don't know. But the reality is there isn't anything like that. And we just need to get used to that. Learn to live with that reality. Because you don't need pills. You need God's grace. Grace, giving, expecting nothing in return. Now, some people do need medication. And if you think you're one of them, see an internist, not a psychiatrist. Psychiatrists will prescribe medication too. But don't trust them. They're not all bad people. But they're trying to mask things. The internist is looking in a microscope trying to see what it is that's the problem and restructure that wrong chemical balance. The psychiatrist tends to try to create an artificial chemical balance. I had a lady once in my church, anecdotal, one time. She was an older woman, probably in her 60s, and I found her one day sitting in a dark living room, rocking in a chair all day. Couldn't go to work, couldn't do anything. What's the matter? I don't know. She'd been to see a psychiatrist. He'd given her medication for it, but it wasn't working. And I said, would you mind showing me your medication? She did. And I wrote down the compound. I went home and looked in the physician's desk reference to see what that medication was and what it did. And I knew that there are, I don't know, anywhere from 10 to 25 side effects to everything. But there are, in small print, in paragraph forms, in the old PDRs, tons of things that might happen. They're not the high percentage. They're the, we don't know what they don't know what a drug's going to do in your body. They got all this stuff. And I read through this thing. It was eye blurring. And I found a side effect to the drug she was taking that resulted in just what I saw in her. I'm not a doctor. I went back to her. And I said to her, when you go to your psychiatrist the next time, oh, by the way, this was, what does he do? Well, hi, how are you doing? Are you getting out? Do you need any more pills? 15 minutes with this guy in a hospital. Ask him if he'll tell you how to get off this, you want to get off the med. In less than 3 weeks, she was out of the house, back to work, driving her car, in church. Anecdotal. Happens. Be careful. The psychological community is not as helpful or as healthy as they make it sound. There's some mighty fine people involved. And there's some mighty bad ones. And you won't know until you know. Try God first. Alrighty, we're getting down to the end. We got, save the best for the end. The Sunday sermon. This evening, the title I've given it is, What's Your Life Testimony? If you have a Bible handy, we're going to be looking at Deuteronomy, chapter 8. I probably should drink some water. My throat is dry. Does it sound funny? Late this afternoon, I got this kind of a froggy thing. I don't know where it came from. I went to church. I lead singing in church. And I could hardly hit the notes, some of the higher notes. I couldn't hit them. And I'm a tenor. I could hit them. I couldn't hit them. I don't know what it is. And now, as I've been talking to you, it's starting to go away. All right, I'm ready. You ready? What is your life testimony? Hey, this is Bible Forum. I'm Warren Sprouse. We're here every Sunday night. One of the things that we do at the end of the show is to look at our Sunday sermon. Tonight I want to draw your attention to the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 8. And ask you the question, what is your life's testimony? Deuteronomy was written to the children of Israel as they were coming out of 400 years of Egyptian bondage. And God said, all the commandments which I command thee this day shall ye observe to do, that ye may live, and multiply, and go in and possess the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers. Talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The list: live, multiply, go in, possess. Clearly, a failure to observe, to do all these things would limit Israel's ability and blessing. And so here's the advance warning. Be careful. Verse 2, and thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness. How did God lead them? Well, he humbled them. He humbled them in order to prove them, in order that you would know what was in your own heart, based on whether you would keep his commandments or not. God knows. He knows before it happens. There are no surprises with God. But you need to know. It says in verse 3, he humbled thee. How? Suffering thee to hunger, and then feeding thee with manna, which thou knewest not, neither did thy fathers know. This was a brand new thing. Who would have thought it? That bread would fall out of the sky, in order that he might make thee know that man doth not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of the Lord. There is no wasted motion with God. If he limits you, it's for a reason. If he blesses you, same thing. And all of this is according to his purpose, not our comfort and not our pleasure. He said in verse 4, remember, thy raiment waxed not old upon thee, neither did thy foot swell these 40 years. Also thou shalt consider in thine heart that as a man chasteneth his son, so has the Lord thy God chasteneth thee. Therefore thou shalt keep the commandments of the Lord thy God, to walk in his ways, and to fear him, to respect him. Why? Verse 7, for the Lord thy God bringeth thee into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and depths that spring out of valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley and vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of oil, olive, and honey, a land wherein thou shalt eat bread without scarceness. Thou shalt not lack anything in it, a land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills thou mayest dig brass. When thou hast eaten and art full, then thou shalt bless the Lord thy God for the good land which he hath given thee. However, verse 11, beware that thou forget not the Lord thy God, in not keeping his commandments and his judgments and his statutes, which I command thee this day. Lest when thou hast eaten and art full, and hast built goodly houses and dwelt therein, and when thy herds and thy flocks multiply, and thy silver and thy gold is multiplied, and all that thou hast is multiplied, then thine heart be lifted up, and thou forget the Lord thy God, which brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, who led thee through that great and terrible wilderness, wherein were fiery serpents and scorpions and drought, where there was no water, who brought thee forth water out of the rock of flint, who fed thee in the wilderness with manna, which thy fathers knew not, that he might humble thee, and that he might prove thee to do thee good at the latter end. In verse 17, to keep you from saying in thine heart, my power and the might of mine hand hath gotten me this wealth. The goal here is that in verse 18, thou shalt remember the Lord thy God, for it is he that giveth thee power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant, which he sware unto thy fathers, as it is this day. And it shall be, if thou do at all forget the Lord thy God, and walk after other gods, and serve them, and worship them, I testify against you this day that ye shall surely perish. As the nations which the Lord destroyeth before your face, so shall ye perish, because ye would not be obedient unto the voice of the Lord your God. Here is Moses' warning, God's solemn warning. But here is also God's encouragement, God's reminder to the children of Israel that they are about to enter the promised land. Do you see anything familiar here? This family, this nation of people were subjected to 400 years of slavery. The brothers sold Joseph into slavery to Egypt 400 years ago. It was not simply a despicable thing to do. It was against all God stands for. Later in the Decalogue, God would emphasize how despicable slavery is. But it was also about building a nation, keeping them together until they were strong enough to take control of the area God had entrusted to them. Had they actually believed God, they would have marched right in from Kadesh Barnea, the southern entrance. But upon arriving there, all they could see was what their eyes showed them, and their fears created. There were giants in the land. That God was there, that God had just delivered them from a much larger, more sophisticated army, that God had shown himself to them at Sinai, none of that mattered. When their flesh was confronted with what appeared to be insurmountable resistance, they ran. And God judged them for that. Every adult that came out of Egypt would die in the wilderness. Their children, too, would age so as not to be the warriors God used when Joshua led them across the Jordan into the promised land. Aren't you glad we don't have things like this to fear? We're comfortable. We're more safe than any people group in the world, more than the world has ever known. What do we have to fear? President Franklin Delano Roosevelt said it best, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. Words given him by his trusted friend, longtime confidant, Lewis McHenry Howell. Words aimed at the tremendous difficulties the nation was facing. Economic, the Great Depression was ravaging the nation. There was social unrest and rampant hedonism abounding. Roaring 20s, bootlegging, mobsters. And on the international stage, there was Hitler, Mussolini, and Japan, all on the move, threatening world peace. There was much to fear. And fear is an unrelenting taskmaster. Over the decades, nothing much has changed. Certainly not from 1933. And not really from the days of Israel's release from bondage. Human beings still live within their own narrow understanding of life and of God. We will still make our decisions, many of them unconscious, according to our natural desire, according to our understanding, our cultural patterns. And since we cannot see the end, we tend to respond to whatever is right in front of us, rather than what God hath said. When we lie, well, it's justified by the circumstances. When we cheat, maybe just not giving the boss an honest day's work, we justify it. When we mistreat others, it's really never our fault, not fully. And when we make decisions, how many of those decisions are taken according to God's long view as opposed to the immediate? We don't know all that God is doing in our lives. Our trials today may be just what God wants. God wants to build my faith, to provide an illustration to my children and grandchildren, my neighbors, my family, my church, people that I know. An illustration of faith and trust in the one true God of heaven. It may be the trial is there to keep me humble, to keep me trusting, focused. We just don't know. But we do know we don't like it. And if there's anything we can do to change it, we're pretty much likely to do it. This is not the way of the faithful believer in the Lord Jesus Christ. The faithful believer has committed themselves to a life of submission to God and trust, a life of illustration and godly power. The world is watching. Your children and grandchildren are watching. What does your life illustrate? You have a bad temper? You are spontaneous, running off in all directions at once? What are you showing these children? A life of giving, expecting nothing in return. When we trade all that for a life of fear or selfishness, we're shaming God. And we know this is true because the world has no respect for those who make a claim of salvation in the Lord Jesus Christ and don't follow through. The world is not reading the Bible, not studying the doctrines. The world is just simply watching you. And what does the world see? If what they see is not anything like what they believe the Bible teaches, what is your message? But if they see a life of surrender, a life of faith, of giving, expecting nothing in return, a life of joy in the midst of circumstances they don't understand anybody could be happy with, they see an entirely different world, a different value system. And where else are they going to see anything like that, if not among Christians? Are you willing to let God lead in your life wherever He wants? Are you willing to wait for God's provision? Do you know how much personal debt people have today in America? God's people are not supposed to be in debt. Even mortgages or car payments or things like that ought to be easily eliminated. You should be able to turn around and sell and get out from under that if the circumstances warrant it. If you get yourself to a place where you can't, you have unsecured debt, you need to pay it off as quick as you can. Are you willing to give to support God's program? We talk about the tithe. We talk about it being 10%. It's not. It's more like 30%. Do you give 10% of your gross to the work of God? You can give it to your local church. Yeah, well, I don't have one. I go to a church, but I sure wouldn't support it. Give it to God. Until you are giving God that tithe, you're not giving anything. Are you being legalistic about it? Well, you could, but only if your heart's not right. But God, knowing the human heart, specified this bare minimum in the Old Testament Decalogue, largely because human beings are prone to justify their own attitudes and behaviors and according to their own values. So he gave them a number. But God is really saying, give me your life. Let me accomplish my purpose. Demonstrate to yourself that you're not locked on to this money. Gotta have that. Let it go. And let it go toward me. Let me show you what I can do. He doesn't say, let me show you what I want, but rather what I can do. He did this with the nation of Israel. He's still doing it. He does it with us, those of us who are born again of the Spirit of God, those of us who are the bride of Christ. And he does it largely by withholding what would be destructive to us and to the plan. The most grievous judgment that we as Christians can receive from God is to have all we want, or to get what our self wants. Withholding our desires, even much of what we think we need, is a blessing only his children receive. Because it does at least two very important things. It demonstrates our faith, our trust in God for all things. I can't afford to give this money. You can't afford not to. We're talking about your spiritual development. We're not talking about whether you have filet mignon next week or whether you actually can pay your bills. If you give to the Lord and you can't pay your bills, your life is way upside down. You need to sell off some stuff and get out from under that. It also strengthens our faith for what's coming. And it glorifies the one true God of heaven who has made us his children. That's a legacy. That's just one of those fascinating things, that the one true God of heaven has made me his son. And you ladies, you're sons too. God has no daughters, because sons are the only ones who inherit. You are a son of God. In that sense, our testimony ought to be that we love God more than we love anything else, and that we're trusting him, meaning that we pray about things and we're careful not to jump into the frying pan, and we're also careful not to stay out of it, when in the frying pan is where God wants us to be. Children of Israel had to learn that lesson. It took them an awful long time. And in the end, they didn't get it. What about you? What is the testimony of your life?